I mean, I've had to submit 2 data requests just recently for information, um, that that was implied that there were board members being accused of things. Emily had to send a data request as well. Who who has ever been on a school board who's had to put in a data request for information? It's almost as if our interim superintendent has been granted the authority to be the board chair, and that is concerning because that's not how this is supposed to go. So it just kind of seems like it's upside down, that the superintendent is at the top, or that's how it's viewed. And any recommendation that comes to the board is supposed to just be rubber stamped and you can't ask questions. And that's just really unfortunate.
The Hudson-Mekeland podcast.
So where this kind of stems from is, if we back up to going into 2022 election cycle, a lot of parents were very concerned about the direction that school boards were going, or schools in general. And we've seen since then that there was a lot of change within school boards as far as who got elected. Fast forward beyond that, then we've seen where when superintendents or school boards or the legacy members, I think is a good way to say it, were not so happy with the newly elected people, they may or may not have taken the best pathway when they couldn't get their way that they wanted. And we saw that in the Elk River, I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, 728. I could be wrong on that. But, and where they were trying to censor those school board members. So now we find ourselves in a very nearby school district with it's not exactly the same, but it's a similar situation. And that's why I reached out to you because you cover the Elk River one heavily. Both you and I have students that are in that school district. So constituent students, I should say. But so at the end of the day, that's where this comes from. And I think both Emily and Jen have a pretty good story to share, and where this is, they can actually explain where it started, where it's at, and where it's going, probably better than anybody.
All right. Well, let's start then with you introducing Emily and Jen, and then we'll start. I'll just start from the top of the screen. We'll start with Jen and then move to Emily, and you guys can kind of give us an overview of what the situation is in the school district there.
Well, I'm Jen. I'm on the Sartell St. Stephen's School Board. I've been on there for a year and a half. We ran in the 2022 election, and we had 3 seats that were up, and 3 of us were running as a slate, and all 3 of us were elected. So that's kind of where we're at right now as far as that part of it.
What prompted you to run as a slate?
Really, all 3 of us just wanted to be involved, and we wanted change. And it was the 3 of us that had stepped up and decided that we were going to do it. I think we just decided to run as a slate because we had a lot of the same core principles as to what we wanted to see change. And so instead of us running individually, we decided to team up and run together.
And just to kind of give us some framework, what would you describe as some of those core principles that brought you guys together as a slate?
One of the big things was trying to remove politics from the classrooms and the district overall. We wanted to see positive changes being made as far as student achievement and just creating a safe environment in that respect. Em, you can jump in anytime.
Oh, I thought we were going one by one, but
sure. Well.
And yeah, I mean, you kind of said it. We had really similar core beliefs. We would have had a lot of the same support from the same areas, so it just made sense to kind of pool resources and do it together. But yeah, getting politics out of the classroom, and by that we meant larger than just politics, but identity politics, which is really permeated here. And we, saw that in the explosion of the equity audit that was conducted in this district and all the downfall from that. yeah, and just in general, the political nature of the classroom and how that has changed education for students. Transparency to information, parents trying to find out what it is their kids are learning, and having those natural roadblocks put up, and wanting to help break down some of those so that it was more of a partnership between school and family, because it had become very adversarial. So those were kind of our core beliefs, our core principles, and we all somewhat stood on that same platform, so it made sense to do it together.
Yeah, and I'll just provide some, for the sake of listeners and viewers, some context, especially if you're not from Minnesota, for what is going on here in this state. And then I want to pivot to specifically what it is that you guys are dealing with in your school district. And what I discovered in interacting with one of the school districts in my legislative district, I'm a state representative here in Minnesota, the Elk River School District 728, Shane mentioned that earlier, was much to my shock and dismay, I guess is the phrase I will use, the extent to which policies which have been adopted certainly by that specific school district, Elk River, but more broadly in school districts throughout the state of Minnesota, have been formulated seemingly with the intention and purpose, certainly the effect of neutering political representation. So you guys talk about this disconnect between what community values are, what parents want, what people assume their school district is about, and the values that are going to be manifested in that school versus the reality of what's actually happening in the school districts. And the rational question is, well, why? Like how and why? How do you get this disparity, this divergence between the community's values and the values that are being pushed hard through the schools? And the answer to that, in part, is the ways in which over time, through both state policy and the influence of, I would say, the Minnesota School Board Association and their model policies, you've created a scenario where school boards aren't actually school boards. School boards have effectively been neutered. And all power has been, through policy, granted to superintendents to just do whatever it is that they want to do. And there have been different mechanisms that have been inserted into the process in order to push back against any school board member, staff member, parent, voter, taxpayer who raises a stink about what's happening in the school district. They are very easily dismissed, ignored, and if they persist, demonized and persecuted. And so with that kind of overview, laying the groundwork, tell me about specifically what's going on. First of all, tell me which school district we're talking about here in Minnesota, and then specifically what it is that you guys are dealing with.
Well, we are in the Sartell St. Stephen. It's District 748. And you kind of teed it up. That's basically, although this situation is very specific, but essentially it is a year's worth of precedent that is built up, which has ceded the vested board authority to administration, to the superintendent, in making many decisions that require school board approval. So essentially the authority has been ceded, and the approval has become more of a rubber stamp. And we're seeing that play out in the situation we're dealing with currently, where individual contracts, not for teachers, not bargaining units, not any of the unions, those have all been settled many months ago. This is just individual contracts that, like you or I would have at our job. They have since February continued to be brought to the board for approval as a lump of 21 contracts. And it's been a continuous blockade. If any one of us as board members have made the demand to separate out a contract or all contracts, which is within our purview to do. So it's been about 5 months ongoing. We've had 2 closed meetings, had one-on-one meetings with the superintendent expressing our concerns about how this process has been handled over the years and the proper way to do it. We've had 3 failed votes in which they continue to bring back the 21 individual contracts in a lump. And myself, Jen and Scott have voted no, not because of the people or the position, but because it's improper the way they're being presented. And we can't let that stand as a precedent, because in the big picture, that's a long term, that's going to disable us in the long term. But it's also not good for other districts. I mean, there needs to be a point where school boards start to take back the authority that's been vested in them by the legislature. So that's where we're at. We're on failed vote number 3, and where it has gotten really to the point of, playing more of a political game is what we're in now, where there's been a special meeting called to vote on these contracts again for the 4th time, to bring them in a lump again. It was called for Tuesday, June 25th, so next week, with no notice to the board. We found out about it in a news article on a local news station that we were being called for a meeting. The board chair did not notify us of this meeting. And unfortunately, not everybody is available to attend. So we are now in a situation where we immediately notified if we were not available. We gave other options for schedule and time, dates, and actually received no response until Friday, in which we received an email from the superintendent stating that the meeting would continue to be held on Tuesday, June 25th, when all 6 of us are not available to be there. So, yeah, that's where we're at. And we're navigating through that.
So Jen, I want to respond to what Emily had to say there, and then I'd like to get your feedback as well. So, I sat on a city council here in Albertville for 7 years, and over the course of that time, my experience on city council was so different than what I'm perceiving the experience of being on a school board is, certainly in Elk River and now in Sartell, from what I'm hearing, where our staff, certainly at the city of Albertville, fantastic. They do their job very well, but the reason why they do it so well is because they know what their role is. Their role is to implement the will of the council and to serve at the pleasure of the council. And so they work for us. We don't work for them. And yeah, they produce draft agendas and what have you, but we certainly have it within our purview at any time, or did when I was on the council, to change the agenda, to modify things, to take things off the consent agenda, what have you. And what I'm hearing, both from what I just heard from Emily and also from what I heard when we had that infamous now Elk River School Board meeting back in December, I believe it was, is elected officials, people who are politically representing the voter, the taxpayer, the resident, the parent, being told by hirelings, superintendent, and what have you, that this is what we're doing, this is the way we're doing it, and you're going to like it, and you're going to go along with it. Is that an accurate summation of what you're experiencing?
Yeah, and so our board makeup is we have 6 board members, so it is literally a 3-3 split. And I have to, we really should have started off with the disclaimer. We're not here representing the board. We're here just talking about our experiences. With that said, our experiences have been what I would say probably vastly different than the other 3. If we question something, the 3 of us, Scott, Emily, or I, if we're questioning something, it's almost as if we have ill intentions, or that's what's perceived, when really it's just a matter of trying to understand what is going on, because things at the school level are very complex. Finance is extremely complex. The day-to-day operations can be extremely complex. But it seems like there's this constant struggle that we're having, that if it's the 3 of us against the 3 of them, and that's not at all why we ran for board. It wasn't to be adversarial or controversial. It was to bring another perspective of those parents who are getting really frustrated with the system and not being able to get answers. And we see that all the time. I've had to submit 2 data requests just recently for information that that was implied that there were board members being accused of things. Emily had to send a data request as well. Who who has ever been on a school board who's had to put in a data request for information? And then we get told all the time, well, the superintendent is our one and only employee, but yet it's almost as if and we have an interim right now, it's almost as if our interim superintendent has been granted the authority to be the board chair. And that is concerning, because that's not how this is supposed to go. If you don't have a check and balance at the top level, then what are you, how do you do checks and balances and hold people, or, classrooms or what have you, accountable for things? So it just kind of seems like it's upside down, that the superintendent is at the top, or that's how it's viewed, and any recommendation that comes to the board is supposed to just be rubber stamped and you can't ask questions, and that's just really unfortunate.
So to that, Jen, just for clarification, so for those that don't are not aware, what have you, the process goes that the school board, whoever is the elected representative body of the school board, then it's up to them, whatever they are, to then hire a superintendent. Is that correct?
That's correct. The board collaborates and hires the superintendent that they believe would be a good fit for the district.
And then beyond that, should the superintendent go off the rails, if you will, based on the community, who has the authority within to dismiss the superintendent?
The school board would be able to, at that point, as long as there would be enough support at that board level to dismiss, and provided there was just cause to do so.
So my point to this is, it is the school board that the people put forward based on their current beliefs, whatever direction things are going. And so the superintendent answers to the elected body, is my understanding and my belief, that and so the school board is the one that represents all of the people that have within the school district. And also, I want to just clarify for both Jen and Emily, both of you have children within the school district. Is that correct?
I have 4 that are currently enrolled in that district, from pre-K to going into 8th grade.
And I have one son who was enrolled in the district, but he goes to a private school now in the district after the COVID equity audit debacle. He will actually be returning to public starting next year as a 5th grader. So he will be back in the district again starting then. So yeah.
The only reason I asked that question was because you are both active parents that have children within the school district. So that was part of why it's so passionate to you to become involved.
Well, yeah, but it's also, it has to be bigger than yourself and your immediate family. I mean, this is for the bigger cause. I mean, but there's thousands of kids in our school district, and they all deserve to have an environment where they shouldn't have to worry about what their identity politics are. It should be okay to have differing viewpoints. And I mean, it's to the point where people really don't want to speak up, especially after what was witnessed after Monday night's board meeting, at the closure of that, where Emily and we were escorted out by a Sartell police officer as we walked through a gauntlet of people being yelled at and cursed at and called names. Like, I mean, what are we setting up for our children if that's how adults are behaving?
Yeah, I think that point can't be stressed enough. Is, often the side of the political discourse that defends the status quo, they'll make much ado about the concept of democracy and the importance of inclusiveness and diversity and making sure that everybody is seen and heard. But what we're hearing here, and what I have seen and what Shane has seen in our interactions with these school board situations, is exactly the opposite. It's very much a demand under policy that you conform, quite literally. I mean, this particular model policy, I believe, I forget what it's called, 209 or something like that, from the Minnesota School Board Association. That particular model policy actually dictates that dissenting school board members must publicly express support for, or at least keep their mouth shut about, policy decisions that they disagree with. How is that democratic? The idea that so for instance, Shane and I were both state representatives. We're currently in the minority under a trifecta, Democrat trifecta. So imagine we couldn't, as a matter of policy, as a matter of ethics, under the rules of our legislative chamber, we weren't allowed to dissent with whatever bills were passed, and whatever laws were enacted at the Minnesota legislature. It'd be absolutely absurd. In order to have a functioning democracy, you have to have dissenting voices. When the Supreme Court makes a ruling, there's a dissenting opinion that is authored where the folks who didn't get their way get to explain exactly what their reasoning was, so that posterity can look at that and consider the wisdom of the way things went and the way they didn't go. And so, to my mind, and I think everybody on this recording agrees, it's absolutely essential that minority voices be heard, and certainly be on the record, and also feel safe. I mean, how often do we hear talk of safety? We need to have safe spaces. We need to create areas where people feel safe to exist as who they are and what have you. Well, what you're describing is not feeling safe to say what you believe and advocate for what you hold to be true as an adult acting as a school board member who's elected to represent people. That's the current reality in the state of Minnesota. And it's absolutely absurd that we have to have this conversation. And first of all, that we're the ones having it. That for a lot of folks who are listening to this might be their first introduction to the fact that this is the reality in the state of Minnesota. They're not hearing about it from the mainstream media. They're not hearing about it from their institutions that are ostensibly set up in order to provide them with feedback in a representative democracy.
Well, and one of the things that's really unfortunate is I have shared the fear of retaliation that we've heard from staff, from parents, from community members. And it just goes to show you, if your elected officials are being treated this way, it's no wonder why parents are afraid to speak up, or staff members or kids. I mean, again, you have adults being treated this way. And honestly, there have been times where I worry about how my kids are treated. And that's not something that we should have to worry about as parents. Our kids spend a lot of time in school, and I'm not saying that my children aren't safe. They are, but it's a fear that if this is how I'm being treated, then how are other children being treated who have a differing point of view?
Well, and it's escalated with some of the rhetoric that is now the narrative that's running through the community, somewhat thanks to the, messaging that has been put out through the media by the superintendent, not by the board chair, but by the superintendent, and some of the emails that have been sent to all district staff. There's a narrative out there that it's not accurate. It's a misrepresentation of what's going on, but it has caused an uproar in the community that has obviously brought in a lot of hostility towards us as elected officials, which we're in that position. And not that I think that it's right or that I appreciate it, but we are in that position. But it has escalated now to the point over the past few days where there has been social media campaigns where they posted all of the donors, anybody that donated to our campaign in 2022, and called for people to call them, confront them, scold them for their actions, or confront them for how could they do something like that. And these are private citizens. They've attached the business names next to the names of the individuals if they're business owners, in hopes that people will boycott them. I mean, this has escalated to a point that is incredibly inappropriate. And it is, yeah. How do you have people that are willing to speak up if this is the reaction that happens when you do so?
Well, and there's just no getting around the fact that the intention of that is intimidation. The intention of that is the suppression of speech. The intention of that is to punish people tangibly in a way that they can feel in their pocketbook, that results in them not being able to put food on the table for their children as a consequence for disagreeing with others politically. That's what you're up against. Jen, I know you got to get going here soon. I just want to get into the weeds a little bit on this issue of the approval of contracts. So I flashed it on the screen a little bit earlier, but we're talking about a wide variety of contracts for non-union employees that properly, in your view, I take it, ought to be considered separately on their merits, and instead they keep trying to push this forward as one giant block. What, in your view, is the rationale behind that? What are they telling you is the reason why they're insisting on doing it that way, and what do you suspect is the actual reason?
What we've heard in public meetings is that there is a fear of changing past precedent into being able to pick people off, which is not the case. The case is these are individual contracts, and as you can see, they're all varying. I mean, it's not just a group of one area. This is a administrative level group of individual contracts, and at a time where we're facing budget cuts, it's just we need to be making sure that what we're spending our money on is appropriate and staffed appropriately and based off of merit. And that's not to say that there is a performance issue or something like that, but just in general, sometimes you have to break what was past practice, so you can take a step back and look and make sure that what you have for staffing is appropriate for where we're at financially and what's best for the district.
Yeah, and what we could have done over the past 5 months, if there would have been, agreement and the ability to separate some of these, is if there was any conversation needed on any, number of individual contracts, any discussion further, we could have had that discussion leading up to the deadline of the end of these contracts and decided, over that time through closed meetings, okay, can we come to agreement on this? Does this need to be staffed differently? Does this need to be staffed at all? I mean, we could have had those discussions, but by continuing to bring them back in a block like this, it has made it impossible to even get to that point. So now we're coming down to the wire. We have no desire to end the contracts with these employees. It's just this process needs to be done in the proper way, and if we don't stand firm on enacting that, it will never change. And it is in the best interest of the district to be fiscally responsible and really review these, and we're not being allowed to do that.
So wait a minute, hold on. So I've done a little digging in this. And obviously it varies by district. I'm not going to speak for all districts. What I do know, what I've learned, is there's a continuing clause in most of these agreements, so that even if there's not a decision made on this by the end of the contract, which I believe is June 30th, new one starts on July 1st, it can ride off into the sunset. They'll continue to operate under the existing contract into perpetuity. And I've talked to many other school board members or previous school board members where this has happened. And then if there is an agreement at that point, a year and a half later, for example, where there was an increase of pay, they get that back pay. Otherwise, so there's all these conditional things in there. If it's a matter of health insurance coverage, for example, and if people want to say that people may lose health insurance coverage, that can be offered. They would have to then, even if it's kind of a arbitrary thing, because they can still offer COBRA, they have to offer COBRA, and then the school board can then vote to pay the COBRA cost to continue them through. This is things that I've heard from multiple other school board individuals that have served on them and have gone through the process. Mm-hmm. So a lot of that is a big part of it. that I think there's a lot of information being put out that is not genuine, and it's not being factual, because somebody's going to lose their occupation or their job or their medical coverage or healthcare coverage, whatever. That is so not the case. And even if this was to pass on July 15th, for example, just arbitrary date, you can make it retroactive, and then the staff within the administration just punches in all the numbers to correct all that. So I find it a little disingenuous that some of what's out there on social media, what I've seen out there, and what I've read, because I find it to be like trying to paint the 3 new board members as like the disruptors, if you will, the ones that are trying to disrupt everything because they're not going to rubber stamp everything. I don't care if you're a school board, a city council, a county commissioner, a state representative, a state senator, all the way up the food chain. I don't really care. You are an elected representative body under our constitutional republic, and it is your job to uphold your oath and your faith to represent the people that elected you. And there's no two ways around that. And obviously we saw through 2020, through 2022, where a lot of parents were showing up at school boards that had a lot of concerns. Whether you agree with them or disagree with them is not the point. A lot of them showed up, and they continue to do so. And a lot of their voices are shut down. So for those that are standing up, God bless you. But at the same time, if this is a tactic they're going to use, and they're going to have to go after like whoever may have donated to a school board candidate, which is probably not a whole lot of donations in the grand scheme of things, and you're going to go after those people and publish their names, it shows how like desperate these people are. When all you're asking to do, and Walter, I will share this opinion with me. I am fairly confident. I've gotten to know Walter well enough. The concept of saying we have to vote this contract through individual, non-bargaining employee contracts. We have to vote it through as a block of 1 when there's 21 in there. That basically you're saying we're going to call it a bargaining unit, which they're not, number 1. Number 2, this is the equivalent of an omnibus bill, which I know both sides of the political aisle absolutely hates because you get a lot of bad with good. Mm-hmm. And this is the equivalent of the exact same thing where, and maybe there's no bad in there. Maybe there's just questions in there. Maybe there's things, because we see it in all the areas where, because of a lot of the stuff that the trifecta has passed upon all these school boards or school districts, they, even though it was historic funding, there was also historic new mandates on them that are not funded. So they have to make budget cuts. So within that context, somewhere it's got to come from. And at the end of the day, I think you two are trying to do, well, you three, unfortunately, Scott can't be here, but you're trying to do the right thing and just question things. Do we really need all of this, or can it be, whatever the scenario is? Because I'm not familiar specifically where the questions lie, but you could certainly get through, which Walter and I know, we could have pounded through probably 1,200 bills in a matter of like a couple days. And then we would settle on the latter, I don't know, couple hundred maybe, or maybe 100. Yeah, we'll belabor that forever. But at the end of the day, we could get through all the stuff we agree on that is really important to everybody. And it's the same kind of scenario. There is absolutely no reason why you would actually condone giving up your position as a singly representative official to vote on something without individually seeking it out and turning it into a single party unit or bargaining unit. That would just be absurd, because you're basically saying you might as well unionize at that point.
Yeah, again, appealing to my experience on city council, we have this thing, and I believe you have it on the school board as well, called the consent agenda, right? And the idea of the consent agenda is these are relatively non-controversial issues that there's unanimity on, should move forward, and we're just going to, basically it's a rubber stamp list, right? Of like, here are things we're just going to rubber stamp because there's nothing really controversial about them. And the way the consent agenda worked when I was on city council is it only took one member to say, I want to pull that from the consent agenda and discuss it. And it may yet pass, and it might pass with a dissenting vote. Oh my gosh, right? Like the idea that there might be disagreement, that we might have a conversation about something and that it might not be unanimous is so anathema to a lot of folks, for, I think, illegitimate reasons. But that process maintains the democratic representation of, hey, if there's an issue and we want to talk about it, even if we're ultimately going to lose on whatever the issue is, at least we get to pull it off this consent agenda and have a conversation about it. And it strikes me that this is a situation that's very analogous to that, where you have, a couple of dozen, however many they are, contracts. You ought to be able to say, okay, we agree with, 10 of the 24 or however many it is. We're okay voting on those with a block, but I want to go through and have a conversation about these other 14 or whatever the number is, right? There should be nothing controversial about that whatsoever. That's literally your job. That's what you were sent there to do. And Shane, this reminds me very much of our experience in the state legislature, where at this point, folks who are paying any amount of attention at all know that it ended in a train wreck where we passed a 1,400-page grand theft omnibus bill that literally it was physically impossible to know what was in it when it was passed, because it wasn't physically printed out and it wasn't available online. And yet the Democrat majority voted yes for they knew not what. That choice in the aftermath of the legislative session was blamed on us as the completely out of power minority, because we spent time filibustering, quote unquote. We talked too much on other bills. Nothing could be further from the truth. They had 2 years to do their work. And as you point out, if you actually engaged with this process in good faith and actually cared about the democracy you claim to value so much, you could have relatively short, orderly deliberations on broadly non-controversial bills that are actually good bills that have gone through a good legislative process, that people might have problems with them. There's going to be people who vote no, but they're bipartisan and what have you. You could do it the right way, and it's not like it's going to take a ton more time. When you bring these huge omnibus bills to the floor, you just end up taking the same, if not longer, debating all of the aspects of it that are more controversial at the expense of really being able to highlight what people broadly agree on. And it sounds like that's largely what we see happening here in school boards as well.
It appears to me it's very similar. And Jen, you can elaborate if you'd like.
Well, what I was going to say too, on top of that, is just making sure that, I'm going to have to take off here, but also making sure that all of those representatives are there for the vote too. I mean, it almost seems right now we're in a situation where there's a known scheduling conflict with 3 members, and we're kind of being told, well, you have, well, that's, so all of us can make it. And that's how you don't want to be in a situation where you're just passing things and voting things through because you have the number of votes either. But with that being said, I'm going to leave that with you, and I have to take off. So I appreciate the conversation. Thank you, everyone, and hope everyone has a great night.
Thanks, Jen.
All right. Well, I don't want to take up a bunch more of your time, Emily, yet tonight. But is there anything else you'd like to add in terms of what the experience has been like and what you're hoping is going to happen going forward?
Well, it's been a wild ride. I'm hoping that we can find a resolution to this, but at the end of the day, the resolution has to be something that honors the vested authority of the board, and we have to have the ability to have the discussions, like you said. The bringing to the table things that we're in agreement about as a lump, fine. But when you know that there's items, or if it's been brought forward that there's items that we need to have further discussion on, just pull those, and we can belabor it, like you said, forever. And that's an option we've brought forward that's been denied. But I mean, I'm hopeful that there is going to be a resolution to this that can end some of the consternation in the community, because there's a lot of uproar from, there's the people who really are just activists and hoping for the reaction. There's a ton of people, though, that I feel genuinely very bad for, because this is a complicated issue. And if they haven't been involved from day one, intimately involved in this, they have absolutely no idea what's going on. They're only hearing the narrative that's coming out. And they probably do have very genuine concerns based on that information. And that's really unfortunate. So I'm hoping that we can come to an agreement here moving forward, so the community can get back to a place where we're just able to have an open discussion, able to express viewpoints freely without fearing that there's going to be either something disastrous that happens, like the district is going to shut down, which is the narrative that's been given, or that somebody is going to be attacked or confronted if they do speak up. So, for the sake of the community as a whole, I really hope that we can come to a resolution here that gets us to that point.
And Emily, to that goes back to my point that even whether it's obviously that the three have a conflict on Tuesday, and so that's not going to work. And my understanding, there was some lack of notification, if you will, for that part of it, and you can get into those weeds on your own merit, but only the chair of the board can call a special meeting, and that was not what happened.
Right.
And then there's a certain number of hour notice, and that just did not play out. Nevertheless, all of that aside, I agree with you that this shouldn't be that complicated, and the messaging being used, put out on social media, using that leverage tool to spin it into wordsmith it into a way that you three are the, I guess, the evil one, if you will, when all you're simply doing is to ask questions about some of these positions, because we can look at many other neighboring schools where they have to make significant cuts. Even the St. Cloud State University is making significant cuts. And it's because of a lot of what's going on a grand scale on many things. And at the end of the day, it's our taxpayers' money that we represent, and it's our fiscal responsibility to represent them well. And to just blanketly say, yeah, we're just going to approve all these six-figure jobs, and we're not going to question anything. And at that, and I'm not saying they're all six-figure jobs. I don't know the specifics of it, but my point is just to arbitrarily take it all in a pillow, if you will, and just pass the whole damn thing. That's where it gets to be problematic, because that's what the higher ups want, the superintendent wants, or the go along legacy members want, because that's how they've always done it.
That's actually, and they say it's because it's how we've always done it. And nothing drives me more crazy than that response. But yeah, I mean, it isn't about the specific people position necessarily, although even if we haven't been able to have a discussion, but it's more about the precedent that is being set if we allow things to happen like this. This has been going on for too long, and it isn't responsible. It's not responsible governance, and that's what we're there to do. So there's principle here that needs to be adhered to, and that's what we're trying to do. I mean, it can be viewed differently in the public, but that isn't actually the point. There's no picking people off. This is a statement to be made about what the vested authority of the school board means and what we're there to do, and try to break the this is how it's always been done statement that continues to be said, because it hasn't been done correctly. Then it may be how it's always been done, but it's been incorrect the whole time.
Yeah, so we got 4 on the list that I'm looking at here that are over 6 figures, and a couple others that are pretty close. But regardless, it's the real question is, are you getting the value that you're paying for? And also, is the perceived value still a value, right? Like, things change, circumstances, inflation, tax base, all these things. Like, that's what you're supposed to be looking at. That's literally what you're elected to look at and deliberate. The idea that all these things are just going to be decided like behind closed doors before the fact, and the public meeting where people actually get to take a look and ostensibly have a voice, that's just going to be this production where we rubber stamp things and don't dig into the details. That's literally the opposite of the way that it's supposed to work.
Right. And there is some difficulty because, there's the private personnel data. So if there was really concerns about an individual contract or individual contracts where there would need to be more discussion about things that just can't happen in a public meeting, that's fine. But what should happen then is those just, get tabled essentially for that meeting. We can have a closed meeting to discuss any of the specifics and make, some sort of headway there. And it'll come back to the table for approval at a later time. That's fine. But we're not even getting to that point. So yeah, I understand why we can't go through, one by one and discuss why, one is, on merits is worthy or why one isn't necessary. That's not really a public conversation necessarily because there is private personnel data, but just from the very base level, we should be able to say these ones need more discussion. These ones we are in agreement on. And that's simply all we're asking for.
And Emily, to that, and I think Walter will agree with me on this, because Walter, he does have a pretty heavy focus at the state on education. It's one of his stronger suits, if you will. And the state put down a lot of mandates, a lot of financially heavy-handed mandates. They like to brag about the historic funding, but the mandates that were unfunded outweighed the funding that they were given. So many schools are looking at deficits, and so they have to make cuts somewhere. So do you want to cut the teacher in the classroom that's actually teaching the kids, that's a good teacher, or do you want to look at some of those administrative positions that may or may not be needed, or could be divided up amongst, two spots could be divided up amongst one. It's calculated decisions because you have to find a place to save $1.5 million, $2 million, whatever amount of money it is. You have to find a place to do it. So do you want to make the kids suffer, or do you want to make middle administration or what have you, like rein that in? Because at a time of need, we all have learned how to pull together. Mama doesn't like to mow, for example, but when I can't be here, she'll help out. Because once in a while, you got to help out and you got to cover.
Right. And to your point, we had absolutely no disagreement when it came to settling the teachers union contract back in October, which there was in many districts due to the financial positions that many of us are in now. The unemployment mandate has been devastating to districts, and us included. And we did not have this big battle royale over that. It was actually a relatively easy negotiation. And so, to have this public perception now as though we have something against just the staff members in general. And there's been, of course, the narrative put out that this is somehow going to then trickle down to teachers and we're going to start, individually reviewing each teacher. It's like, there has been literally zero evidence in our time on the board thus far that that's where this is going. It's just like what you said, Shane, we have to, where we do have the ability to look at individual contracts, we need to. And that doesn't mean that anything changes, but we should have the ability to discuss them in detail and decide as a board, not as the superintendent, but as a board, which ones are we going to move forward with? Are there changes that need to be made? So on and so forth.
Well, I appreciate both you and Jen joining us this evening to discuss this, and hopefully we can get the word out. Certainly, it's going to be on our channels, and we'll share it far and wide. But folks need to get engaged. They need to pay attention to what's going on. Don't think that this is something that's unique to Sartell, unique to Elk River. These types of stories are happening all over the place, whether you're hearing about them or not. And often it's folks who, unlike Emily and Jen, are not willing to step forward and put their face to a testimony and their name to a testimony and tell you what's going on for fear of the persecution that they're going to receive from the establishment, from the status quo. That's not the way democracy is supposed to work. But thank you guys very much so for being willing to come on and talk to folks about it.
Well, thank you for letting us share our story here. Thanks for having us on.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Emily.
The Hudson-Mekeland podcast with hosts and Minnesota State Representatives Walter Hudson and Shane Mekeland. Follow, subscribe, like, and share to show your support. On X, find Walter at Walter Hudson and Shane at Shane Mekeland, spelled Mekeland.